The moment Lydia Langley dropped her bouquet of wild desert flowers on the church steps and walked straight into the open wilderness without a single word, every soul in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory, stood watching with their mouths hanging open like broken barn doors. Every soul except one. The year was 1878, and the town of Redemption Creek had seen its share of droughts, dust storms, and desperate men. But nobody in living memory had seen anything quite like what Lydia Langley did on what was supposed to be the happiest Saturday of her 23 years. The church bells had been polished for the occasion. The preacher, Reverend Caleb Dorn, had traveled 40 miles from Santa Fe for the ceremony. The townswomen had baked enough apple pie to feed a cattle drive. And Gerald Whitmore, the groom, stood at the altar in a pressed linen suit, his blonde hair slicked back with pomade, looking every inch the successful land deed broker he was determined to become. Lydia had stood in the small back room of the church, listening to the organ begin its slow, waddling march, and something inside her chest had simply refused. It was not a whisper. It was not hesitation. It was a full, roaring refusal that moved up through her stomach and into her throat until she could not breathe. She looked down at her hands holding those desert flowers, yellow brittlebush and white prickly poppy, and she saw the rest of her life laid out before her as clearly as a map drawn in ink that could not be erased. She saw Gerald's carefully managed smile. She saw the Whitmore house with its locked parlor and its rigid dinner schedule. She saw herself becoming smaller and quieter with every passing season, until there was nothing left of her but a pleasant shape in a chair by a fireplace. She set the flowers down on the windowsill with a gentleness that surprised even her. She picked up her skirts. She walked through the back door of the church, not the front, and when she emerged onto the dusty street she did not stop walking. She passed the millinery shop. She passed the trough where the horses drank. She passed the last fence post at the edge of town, and then the earth opened up before her in all its terrible and magnificent enormity, and she kept walking. The congregation had heard the organ stop. They had heard the murmuring and shuffling that followed. Reverend Dorn had stepped out to the front of the church, shading his eyes against the blazing October sun, and watched the white figure of Lydia Langley growing smaller and smaller against the vast canvas of red rock and scrub brush and open sky. Gerald Whitmore had come to stand beside him. He had looked for exactly 4 seconds, and then he had gone back inside and poured himself a glass of bourbon from the flask he kept in his jacket pocket, because Gerald Whitmore was a man who adapted quickly to the preservation of his own dignity. Patrick Hawkins had not been inside the church. He was not invited to weddings as a rule, not the kind of man who received invitations printed on thick cream paper and delivered by the postmaster's boy. He was the kind of man who could be found at the livery stable on the east side of town, repairing tack and mending bridles, or out on the mesa with his roan horse, doing the sort of quiet work that kept a man fed without requiring him to own anything more than a bedroll and a decent saddle. He was 28 years old, broad in the shoulders from years of physical labor, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of river stone after rain. He had come to Redemption Creek 3 years ago from somewhere he did not often discuss, taken on work with the livery owner, a weathered man named Abel Croft, and had stayed because he found no particular reason to leave. Patrick had been sitting outside the livery on an overturned crate, stitching a broken leather cinch, when he heard the commotion from the church 300 yards away. He had looked up and seen the white dress, small and bright as a morning star, moving steadily away from the town and out into the open land. He had watched for a long moment, the cinch forgotten in his hands. He had watched the cluster of people on the church steps doing nothing. He had watched the white dress get smaller. He had set down the cinch strap and the needle. He had stood up. He had gone to the corral, taken his roan horse by the bridle, and without saddling her, there was no time for that, he had swung up onto her bare back and ridden after Lydia Langley at a measured pace, because he did not want to frighten her. Lydia heard the horse before she saw it. She was perhaps a half-mile from town by then, moving through the coarse grass and loose red rock of the high desert, her wedding dress gathering dust and small thorns along its hem. She did not turn around. She kept walking, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the purple outline of the San Andres Mountains in the distance. She had no plan. She had no destination. She had water in neither hand and food in neither pocket. She had only the absolute certainty that she could not go back to that church, and the absolute terror of what lay ahead, and she was choosing the terror because at least it was honest. "Miss Langley," Patrick said, not loudly. He pulled the roan to a walk beside her, keeping easy pace with her long strides. She did not look at him. "Go back, Mr. Hawkins." He kept the horse walking. "That's not going to happen. I am not your concern." "No," he agreed. "But the desert after sundown is a concern to anybody who is in it without water or a coat." She stopped then, and she turned to look at him fully for the first time, shielding her eyes with her hand. She had met Patrick Hawkins perhaps a dozen times in the 3 years he had worked in Redemption Creek. She had collected a horse from the livery once when her father's mare threw a shoe. She had passed him on the street on market days. She had never had occasion to speak with him at length, but she knew what the town said about him, which was very little, which she had always privately thought was a better recommendation than a man about whom everything was known and catalogued. His face now in the raw October sunlight was careful and direct. There was nothing in it that looked like pity, and that was what kept her from shouting at him to leave her alone. "What are you doing out here?" she asked. "Same thing you are," he said, "going somewhere." "I don't know where I'm going." "Neither do I," Patrick said, "but I've got a horse." Something in Lydia's chest shifted. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the small crack where trust would eventually enter. She looked back once toward Redemption Creek, which was now just a smudge of buildings and the white spire of the church against the sky. She looked forward again at the wide open land, at the mountains, at the sky which was so blue it almost made her feel angry at its indifference. "Do you have any water?" she asked. He reached back and unhooked a canteen from the side of the horse's makeshift rope halter. He handed it to her without ceremony. She drank 2 long swallows and handed it back. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Can you ride?" "My whole life." He offered her his hand and she took it, and she swung up behind him onto the roan's bare back with a practicality that clearly surprised him, because she felt the slight adjustment in his posture, the acknowledgement. She settled, bunching the skirt of the wedding dress around her knees, and she put her hands on either side of his waist to keep her balance, and Patrick Hawkins turned the horse westward toward the foothills, and they rode away from Redemption Creek together, the dust rising in lazy spirals behind them. They did not speak much for the first hour. The land moved beneath them in long, rolling waves of red and brown, punctuated by clusters of juniper, and the occasional stark white trunk of a cottonwood where water ran underground. The sun was high and hot, the air carrying that particular dry warmth of the New Mexico October that would turn cold and sharp the moment the sun touched the horizon. Lydia watched the ground passing and felt something happening inside her that she could not immediately name. It was not happiness. It was too raw for happiness. It was relief of a kind so profound it felt almost like grief, because you cannot feel that level of relief unless you were imprisoned in the first place, and she had not allowed herself to understand how imprisoned she had been. She had been engaged to Gerald Whitmore for 14 months. The engagement had been arranged with the quiet and efficient ruthlessness of 2 families, deciding that a merger was in their mutual interest. Her father, Clement Langley, owned the largest mercantile in Redemption Creek. Gerald's father, Howard Whitmore, owned 300 acres of land south of town and was acquiring more through the kind of paper transactions that moved faster than conscience. There was nothing violent about the arrangement. There was nothing overtly cruel. Gerald did not hit her. Gerald did not shout. Gerald simply looked at Lydia in the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that will go well in a room he is planning, and after 14 months of that look, Something in her had broken open and refused to be repaired by good manners and bridal planning. "You do not have to tell me anything," Patrick said, after a long while into the silence. "I know," she said. And then, unexpectedly, she did. She told him about the look. She told him about the parlor she was not allowed to change. She told him about the dinner schedule. She told him about the night Gerald had corrected her in front of his business associates for expressing an opinion about water rights in the territory, his hand on her arm a pressure that was not a grip, but communicated everything a grip would communicate. She told him about the desert flowers she had chosen herself for the bouquet because she could not bear to stand in that church holding something that had been ordered from a catalog. Patrick listened without interrupting. He kept the horse to a steady walk. "Nobody said any of this was wrong," Lydia said. "That was the thing. Everyone looked at me and told me I was fortunate." "People say that a lot," Patrick said, "about things that aren't fortunate." "Did anyone try to stop me?" she asked. "After I left, there was a pause. Not that I could see," he said honestly. She expected to feel hurt by that, but she found she did not. She found instead a kind of clarity. The people of Redemption Creek were not cruel. They were simply people who had decided that what was expected was what was right. And Lydia had spent 23 years trying to fit herself into that equation, and she was finished. They made camp that first night in the shelter of a sandstone outcropping about 8 miles from town, where a cluster of pinon pines gave some windbreak and there was enough dry wood for a fire. Patrick had saddlebags on the roan. He had gone back briefly to get them while she waited, and in those bags were hardtack, dried beans, a small tin coffee pot, matches, a blanket, and a spare wool coat. He handed her the coat without a word when the sun went down, and the temperature dropped with the abruptness of the high desert, and she pulled it around her shoulders over the wedding dress which had, by this point, acquired so many dust stains and small tears along the hem that it looked less like a bridal garment, and more like something a ghost would wear. The fire was good. The coffee was hot and bitter, and she held the tin cup with both hands and drank it, and felt it move through her from the inside. "What are you going to do?" Patrick asked. He was sitting across the fire from her, his forearms resting on his knees, looking at the flames. "I don't know," she said. "Go somewhere. Somewhere that isn't here." "Where would you go?" She thought about it seriously. "I have an aunt in Tucson, my mother's sister. She was never married. She has a house and she takes in sewing. My mother always said she was an eccentric." Lydia paused. "I think eccentric meant she made her own choices." "Tucson is about 150 miles from here," Patrick said. "Rough country, I know. You'd need supplies, a real saddle, company on the road." She looked at him across the fire. "Are you offering?" He met her eyes, and in the firelight his face was very still, the way still water is still, not empty but deep. "I haven't got anywhere particular to be," he said. Lydia studied him for a long moment. This was a man she did not truly know. She knew his name and his work and the undemanding way he occupied a space, but she did not know his history or his character in the full sense. And yet she had ridden 8 miles into the wilderness behind him and drunk water from his canteen and was sitting at his fire wearing his coat, and there was not one single part of her that felt afraid of him. That itself was information. "All right," she said. "But I want it understood that I am not trading one situation for another. I am not," she stopped. "I am going to my aunt in Tucson as a free person." "That's the only way anybody should go anywhere," Patrick said, and looked back at the fire. She slept that night wrapped in the blanket with the coat over her shoulders, the stars above the sandstone outcropping so thick and brilliant they looked like spilled salt on black cloth. She had not slept that well in over a year. In the morning, Patrick rode back toward town, while Lydia waited by the cold ashes of the fire, and she spent the time pulling the worst of the thorns from her skirt, and sitting in the early sun with her knees drawn up, watching a pair of ravens work the thermals above the rock face. She had the strange sensation of having been reborn without dying, which she supposed was what freedom felt like before you had learned to wear it properly. Patrick returned 2 hours later with a second horse, a sturdy bay mare that he had bought from Abel Croft for a fair price along with a proper saddle, a set of riding clothes that had belonged to Croft's daughter, flour and salt meat and dried fruit, 2 blankets, a water skin, and a second canteen. He also brought a letter, which he handed to her with a look that prepared her for its contents. The letter was from her father. It was not long. It said that Gerald Whitmore was not pursuing any legal action, as he had decided the matter of the broken engagement was best handled quietly. It said that Lydia's dowry goods had been returned. It said that her father was very disappointed and that the family name had been embarrassed. And then, at the very bottom, in handwriting that was different from the rest, slightly shaking, slightly uncertain, it said, "Be safe. Your mother would have understood." Lydia read that last line 3 times. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the inside pocket of Patrick's spare coat. She would keep it. It was not everything she needed from her father, but it was something, and she had learned long ago to value what was real over what was wished for. She changed into the riding clothes behind the sandstone, a dark cotton skirt, a plain white blouse, and sturdy leather boots that were only half a size too large, and then she rolled the wedding dress up tight and tucked it into the bottom of one of the saddlebags. She was not sure why she kept it, perhaps as evidence, perhaps as a reminder. Perhaps because it had been made by the hands of the seamstress Mrs. Clara Ortiz, who had put 6 weeks of careful labor into it, and deserved better than to have it abandoned on a rock in the desert. They set out heading southwest under a sky the color of hammered tin, with the morning cold still sitting in the low places of the land. Patrick rode the roan and Lydia rode the bay mare, and there was between them from the first morning a quality of companionship that neither of them had to work very hard at, which was new for both of them in different ways. Patrick had grown up in the Texas Panhandle, he told her on that second day, as they navigated a dry arroyo that cut through the red earth like a wound. His father had been a drover, working the cattle trails north from San Antonio, and Patrick had ridden his first full trail at age 15. His mother had died when he was 12 of a fever that swept through their part of the Panhandle the same summer the grass burned. He had a sister somewhere in Kansas, married to a farmer, last he heard. He had drifted after his father's death, working cattle, working horses, working whatever honest work was offered, until he had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years ago and found himself staying because Abel Croft was a fair employer and the country suited something in him that he had never exactly named. "You never wanted land of your own?" Lydia asked. "A place." He was quiet for a moment. "I wanted it in the way a man wants something he doesn't believe he'll have," he said. "It stops feeling like wanting and starts feeling like something else." "What does it feel like?" He looked at her sideways, the roan picking her way carefully around a sprawl of prickly pear. "Like looking at a window from outside," he said. She understood that in a way she had not expected to. She had spent her whole life on the inside of a window that she had not wanted to look out of, because what was outside had always frightened her, and now she was outside and the frightening part had turned out to be the smallest part of it. She told him this. He listened to her explain it, and when she was finished he said, "I think that's the bravest thing I've heard a person say." "It doesn't feel brave," Lydia said. "It feels like I was just very late." "Most brave things feel that way," he said. On the 3rd day, they reached the small settlement of Oso Blanco, which consisted of a trading post, a water well, a cluster of adobe buildings, and a population of perhaps 30 souls, including the Jicarilla Apache families who camped seasonally near the spring a mile south of the post. The trading post was run by a man named Felix Delgado, who was 50 years old, had a white beard, and moved through his cluttered store with the unhurried competence of a man who had sold goods in the same space for 20 years and intended to sell them for 20 more. Felix Delgado looked at Lydia and Patrick when they came through his door, took in the combination of the riding clothes and the bay mare and the quiet way they occupied space together, and said nothing about any of it except to ask what they needed. They needed grain for the horses, salt, flour, dried beans, and 2 pairs of winter socks, because the nights were getting genuinely cold now. Felix provided all of these at a fair price, threw in a round of cornbread from his wife Rosa's kitchen for nothing, and told them that the road southwest toward Tucson was passable, but that there was a section through the Organ Mountains that wanted care, particularly if they were heading that way before the middle of November, because snow came early in the higher passes. Patrick thanked him and asked about water sources on the route. Felix produced a hand-drawn map on the back of a flour sack and marked 3 reliable water holes and 2 that were seasonal, indicating the seasonal ones with an X and a note that said, "Maybe," written in his neat, small hand. Rosa Delgado brought out a second piece of cornbread and looked at Lydia with the particular directness of a woman who has seen everything and has stopped being surprised by it, and said, in Spanish-accented English, "You need a clean dress, I think." Lydia looked down at herself. The riding clothes were clean enough, but it was true that she had been wearing them for 3 days. "I would be very grateful," she said. Rosa Delgado led her to a small back room and produced a dark blue cotton dress with a practical cut that fit Lydia with only a small alteration at the waist, which Rosa accomplished with a few quick pins and a running stitch while Lydia stood still and thought how strange and good it was to be shown this kind of uncomplicated kindness by a woman she had never met before. "Where are you going?" Rosa asked, the needle moving. "Tucson," Lydia said. "To my aunt." Rosa nodded. "And the man?" "He's escorting me." Rosa made a small sound that was not quite a comment but was not quite not one either. "He watches you," she said, "the way a man watches something he is afraid to look at too long." Lydia thought about that for a long time after they left Oso Blanco. They camped that night near the first of Felix's reliable water holes, a small natural basin in the rock fed by a seep spring, with cottonwoods around it that had gone yellow in the October cold. The horses drank and then stood companionably in the dark, and Lydia and Patrick sat by the fire and ate beans and salt pork, and listened to the silence of the desert at night, which was not really silence at all but a layering of small sounds. The wind, the distant cry of a coyote, the occasional pop of the fire, that composed themselves into something that felt almost like music. "Tell me something nobody else knows about you," Lydia said. She had not planned to say it. It came out of the fire-lit ease between them. Patrick turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I read," he said finally, "books. Anything I can get, novels, newspapers, almanacs. I have a crate of them in Abel Croft's back room." He paused. "People think it's strange, a man like me." "A man like you?" she asked. "A man who sleeps in a livery stable." "Books are not strange," Lydia said flatly. "Anyone who thinks they are is wrong." She paused. "What do you read?" "Lately, Mr. Dickens," he said. "Before that, Mr. Cooper. I read about the sea sometimes, which I have never seen." "I have never seen it either," Lydia said. "I used to dream about it when I was small. My mother had a painting of the ocean on the wall of our parlor, a ship on green water." She was quiet a moment. "She died when I was 16, my mother, fever." "I'm sorry," Patrick said, and it was the kind of sorry that did not ask anything further, only acknowledged the weight of it. "She was the one who would have understood about today," Lydia said. "About the church. My father said so in the letter." "What was she like?" Lydia smiled. And it was the first time Patrick had seen her smile fully, without reservation, and it changed her face in a way that made him look at the fire quickly. "She used to argue with the preacher," Lydia said. "Politely, with evidence. She read the Bible more thoroughly than he did, and she was not shy about it. She made her own bread, and she refused to follow anyone's recipe. She sang too loudly in church, and she did not care." She paused. "She would have told me to walk out long before I did." "It sounds like you were her daughter all the way through," Patrick said. Lydia looked at him, and there it was again, that thing Rosa Delgado had identified, the way he looked at her and then found something else to look at. She thought she understood what it was. She thought she understood it because she was beginning to do it herself, which was inconvenient and significant, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, not to herself. Patrick, she said, and saying his given name for the first time felt deliberate, felt like a door she was choosing to walk through. Why did you come after me? The truth, not the part about water and the desert. He was very quiet for a long time. The coyote called again, further away now. The fire settled. I have seen you for 3 years, he said slowly, the words placed with care. Collecting that horse when your father's mare threw a shoe, on the street on market days. In the mercantile once when I was buying rope. He stopped. Every time I saw you, I thought that you looked like someone who was looking for a door. He paused again. When I saw you walk out of that church, I thought someone should follow her, not to bring her back, just to make sure she didn't walk into the desert alone. The fire popped. Lydia did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "That is the kindest reason anyone has ever given for anything." They left it there for that night, because some things need to live in the air for a while before they can be held in the hand. The days that followed built themselves into something that Lydia would later think of as the most honest time of her life. They rode long days through the changing country, from the high desert of the Red Rock country, down through the Chilarosa Basin with its strange white dunes of gypsum that caught the light like snow, and then turning southwest through the lower scrub and the long gradual slopes toward the mountains. The country was enormous and various, and it demanded attention and respect, and the necessity of managing horses and water and firewood, and the practical negotiations of the trail left no room for pretending or performing, which was the thing Lydia realized she had been doing her entire adult life, performing the person she was supposed to be. Here, she was simply who she was. She was competent on horseback, and she was not shy about it. She had a good sense of direction, and she could read the sky for weather with a reliability that impressed Patrick, who told her so plainly. She was funny in a dry, unexpected way that emerged in quiet comments delivered without expression, and they discovered this about each other, that they both had the kind of humor that lived in understatement, in the small pointed observation delivered without fanfare, and it made them laugh at unexpected moments, out in the middle of nowhere, with only the horses and the sky to witness it. She asked him one morning as they crossed the white flats of the basin whether he had ever been close to being married. "Once," he said, "in Texas, a girl named Catherine." He rode on for a moment. "Her father decided he wanted a man with land. I didn't have any." He said it without bitterness, which she thought was its own kind of sadness. She did what she thought she was supposed to do. I think about that sometimes. "Do you still think about her?" Lydia asked, and she was surprised to find that she cared about the answer in a way that was not idle. "No," Patrick said. "I think about the idea of her. There's a difference." She thought about Gerald Whitmore. She did not think about him as a person she had loved and lost. She thought about him as a representative of a life she had almost been swallowed by, and she felt sorry for him too, in a detached way, sorry that he was a man so formed by his own certainties that he could not imagine a woman as anything but a fixture in his arrangements. That kind of rigidity had to be its own prison. "I never loved him," she told Patrick. "I want you to know that. I am not a woman fleeing a broken heart. I am a woman fleeing a room that was being locked." "I know that," Patrick said. "You don't have to explain it to me." "I want to," she said. "I want you to know exactly who I am." He looked at her then with the full weight of his attention, which was not a demanding thing but was a very present thing, like the warmth of a fire felt from across a room. "I'm listening," he said. And she told him. She told him about growing up in Redemption Creek, about her mother's intelligence and her father's ambition, and the way those two things had never quite resolved in their household. She told him about the books she had read by hiding them under more acceptable books. She told him about wanting to be a teacher, which she had announced at the age of 17, and which had been gently and thoroughly discouraged. She told him about the year she had worked in her father's mercantile after her mother died, learning to run accounts and manage inventory, and how she had been genuinely good at it and how that had been treated as temporary, a stopgap until a husband was found. She told him about the proposals she had turned down before Gerald, 3 of them, each one more practical than the last, each one chosen by her father with increasing urgency. Patrick listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "You should have been a teacher." "I know," she said. "Maybe I still will be." He looked at her with something in his face that she was learning to read, a quality of hope held carefully, like a man carrying water in cupped hands. "I think you'll do whatever you decide to do," he said. "That's not a thing I say lightly." They made camp that night in the foothills of the San Andres Mountains, where the juniper was thick and the air had the bite of altitude in it. They had been traveling for 6 days. Lydia's muscles had settled into the rhythm of riding. Her hands had calluses in new places. Her hair, which she had taken out of its wedding arrangements on the first night and braided plainly, suited her face in a way the elaborate upswept style never had. She cooked that evening. She had taken over the cooking on the third day, not because Patrick could not cook, because he could manage basic camp food with competence, but because she was simply better at it and they both knew it, and it had become a natural division of effort without either of them having to negotiate it. She made a stew from the dried beans and salt pork and some wild onion she had found growing near the water source, and she added a pinch of the cayenne she had bought from Rosa Delgado's store in Oso Blanco. And it was the kind of meal that tasted perfect, because it was hot and real and made with care and eaten in good company. After they had eaten, Patrick was tending the horses, and Lydia was washing the tin plates in the small amount of water she had kept back for the purpose, when she heard him say something that was not quite a word but was a sharp, alert sound. She looked up. There were 2 riders coming down the hillside toward their camp. She did not panic, but she set down the plates and stood up straight. Patrick was already between her and the approaching riders, not dramatically, not with any display, but simply repositioned, which she noticed. The riders came into the firelight. They were not threatening, as it turned out. They were a father and son, both Mexicano, traveling north from Las Cruces with a mule loaded with hides to trade at Oso Blanco. The father was named Aurelio Ramos and was perhaps 55. The son was named Thomas and was 17, too young to be out on the trail alone but clearly experienced in the company of his father. They had seen the fire and hoped it was not the wrong kind. It was not the wrong kind. Patrick invited them to rest and offered the remainder of the stew, which they accepted with the kind of careful politeness that speaks to men who have learned that kindness in the wilderness is real and should be acknowledged properly. Aurelio Ramos spoke good English, as did Thomas, and they talked around the fire about the road south, about the state of trade in Las Cruces, about the dry summer that had shortened the grass and worried the ranchers, about the railroad that was coming. Everyone was talking about the railroad coming. It seemed to be the thing on every tongue in the territory, and about the small practical matters of travel in a country that did not accommodate carelessness. Aurelio Ramos looked at Lydia and Patrick with the same unhurried assessment that Felix Delgado had employed, and he said, as he rose to leave, "You are both good people. It is easy to see." He said it simply and without embellishment, as an observation of fact, and it sat in Lydia's chest for a long time after the Ramos men had moved on up the trail. Good people. She thought about what it meant to be seen that clearly by a stranger in the dark. She thought about what it meant that Patrick Hawkins was one half of that assessment. It was on the 8th day, when they were navigating the lower passes of the mountains and the wind had come up strong and cold from the north, rattling the junipers and sending dust devils spinning across the trail, that something shifted in the explicit atmosphere between them and could not be shifted back. They had stopped to water the horses at a narrow creek that ran between 2 boulder faces, and Lydia had dismounted and was leading the bay mare to the water when her boot slipped on a wet rock, and she went down on her knee sharply. It was not a serious fall. She was up again in a second, more startled than hurt, but Patrick was beside her before she had fully registered what had happened, his hand at her elbow, his face close, and she looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that was no longer careful and controlled, that was in fact the opposite of careful and controlled, that was open in a way his face was not usually open, and she understood with sudden, total clarity that Rosa Delgado had been exactly right. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "I know," he said, but he did not let go of her elbow. They stood like that for a moment that felt much longer than a moment, the horses drinking behind them, the wind moving through the juniper, the cold creek water running over the stones between them. And then Lydia put her free hand against his chest, not pushing, not pulling, simply placing it there the way you place your hand on solid ground to confirm it is real, and she felt his breathing change under her palm. "Patrick," she said. "I know," he said again, and this time it was an acknowledgement of something else entirely. She lifted up onto her toes and kissed him. It was brief and certain and warm, and when she pulled back she kept her hand on his chest and looked at him and he looked at her, and there was nothing confused about it, nothing ambiguous. It was one of the clearest things that had ever happened to either of them. "I did not intend to complicate things," she said. "You haven't complicated anything," Patrick said. "You've simplified it considerably." She laughed at that, and he smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face, and she stored that away in the place where she was keeping all the things she was learning about him. They rode on through the afternoon with the thing between them changed and acknowledged but not rushed, not grabbed at. Lydia had spent enough of her life being moved toward things at someone else's pace. She was going to let this thing find its own pace. Patrick seemed to understand this without being told, because he was a man who understood pace horses had taught him that, and he gave her the space and the time and did not press anything. But that evening when the fire was going and the wind had dropped and the stars were enormous over the mountain pass, they sat close together against the same boulder, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and he turned his face into her hair briefly, barely a moment, and she thought that this quiet recognition, this unhurried acknowledgement of each other was what love was supposed to feel like. Not the performance of it, not the arrangement of it, the actual thing. They came down out of the mountains on the 11th day, and the country changed again, growing lower and warmer, the vegetation shifting from juniper and pine to mesquite and ocotillo, the sky becoming wider, the distances growing in that particular way that distances grow in the Sonoran Desert, which is to say they became philosophical. You could see 50 miles in every direction, and each mile was instruction in humility. They passed through a small settlement called Cottonwood Wells, which had a water station for the stage line and a general store, and a man named Harvey Brooks who ran the station, and who had a wife named Edna who insisted on feeding them supper before they moved on. Edna Brooks was 60 years old and had the manner of a woman who had made a decision very early in life that she would be comfortable everywhere, and had stuck to that decision with admirable consistency. She sat them down at a scrubbed pine table and served them roasted venison and squash and fresh-baked cornbread, and then she sat across from them and looked at them with frank, warm curiosity. "Heading to Tucson?" she asked. When Lydia confirmed this, Edna said, "You've got about 4 more days, maybe 3 if you push. The road is decent most of the way. There was trouble on the San Pedro crossing last month. A couple of men jumped a stage, but it's settled since. Harvey can give you the latest on the road conditions before you leave." Harvey Brooks appeared from the back of the store and provided Patrick with a thorough account of the road, the water sources, and the current status of the route. He was a careful, methodical man, the kind who treated information as a serious responsibility, and Patrick listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Before they left the next morning, Edna pressed a wrapped parcel into Lydia's hands. Inside was a warm wool shawl dark green, well made, and a small jar of apple preserves. "You look like a woman who has figured something out," Edna said. "The shawl is for the cold nights. The preserves are for the other mornings." Lydia held the parcel and felt something move through her that was not quite tears but was in the territory of tears. "Thank you," she said, with genuine feeling. I won't forget your kindness." Edna waved this off. "Go on. You've got somewhere to be." It was on the third day out of Cottonwood Wells, when they were crossing the open flats along the Gila River, and the sky ahead had turned the color of bruised apricot in the late afternoon light, that Patrick said what he had been moving toward for the entirety of the journey. They had stopped to rest the horses on a low rise above the river, and Lydia was standing at the edge of the rise looking at the country ahead, the green ribbon of the river valley, and beyond it the dark shapes of the mountains, and beyond that, somewhere in the haze of distance, Tucson and her aunt's house, and the next chapter of whatever her life was going to be. She was thinking about all of it. She was also thinking about Patrick. He came to stand beside her. He had his hat in his hands, which she had noticed was a thing he did when he was working up to something difficult, as though he needed something to hold. "Lydia," he said. She turned to look at him. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need to say it right, so I am going to ask you to let me get through it." "All right," she said. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever been in the presence of," he said, "and I mean that in the full and real sense of the word, not as a compliment offered because I want something, as an honest account of what I have observed over the last 2 weeks." He paused. "You walked out of a church and into the wilderness, and you did it with more dignity than most men I know would have had. You navigated this whole country with good sense and competence. You have made me laugh more in 12 days than I have laughed in 3 years. You have told me the truth about yourself, all of it, including the parts that weren't flattering, and that is—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not a man with much to offer in the material sense. I have a horse and a saddle and a crate of books and whatever I can earn with my hands. But I am a man who will tell you the truth and listen to yours, and I will never look at you like a piece of furniture, not for one day of my life. And he pressed on, "I love you. I have been coming toward that understanding for a while now, but I want to say it plainly. And I am not saying it to complicate your plans or put pressure on you. I'm saying it because it's true, and you deserve to know true things." The late light moved across the river below them. A heron lifted from the reeds and made its slow, ancient way across the sky. Lydia looked at Patrick Hawkins, at the hat held in his hands, at the honest set of his face, at the river stone gray of his eyes in the late light. And she thought about all the ways she had been talked at, and talked around and managed and arranged. And she thought about the difference between that and this, between being treated as an item on a list and being seen as a complete person by a complete person. And she felt the fullness of it move through her chest like the first warm current of spring through cold water. "Patrick," she said, and her voice was steady and certain, "I have been in love with you since the 5th day when you made me coffee and didn't say a word for an entire hour, and it was the most comfortable silence I had ever been inside." She took a step toward him. "I am not a woman who says things I don't mean. I am telling you that I love you." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. And then he reached out and took her face in both his hands and kissed her there on the rise above the Gila River with the sunset turning the whole world gold around them. And it was not brief this time, and it was not tentative. It was the kind of kiss that is a conversation and a promise and an arrival all at once. They stood together for a long time after that, looking at the country ahead, and Lydia thought she had never seen anything more beautiful than what was in front of her. The river and the mountains and the enormous sky, and all of it pointing toward a future she was going to shape with her own hands. They arrived in Tucson on a Wednesday in early November, riding in from the east on a road that was wide and well-traveled, the city sprawling ahead of them in the warm southern afternoon light. Tucson in 1878 was a city of perhaps 7,000 people, larger than anything Lydia had seen since her one trip to Santa Fe as a child. And after 2 weeks in the open wilderness, it felt overwhelming in the way cities feel when you have been in open country, loud and close-quartered, and full of the smell of people and horses and commerce. but it was also alive in a way that Redemption Creek had never quite been, with its mix of people American, Mexican, Tohono O'odham, people from every direction of the country moving through its streets, and the adobe buildings and the palm trees and the warm, slightly sweet smell of the desert south. Her aunt, Helena Marsh, lived on a quiet street near the edge of the city in a small adobe house with a garden that had gone a little wild for lack of attention. She was 51 years old with iron-gray hair and her sister's eyes, and when she opened the door and found Lydia on her doorstep in road-dusty riding clothes with a tall man holding 2 horses in the street behind her, she looked at the scene for exactly 3 seconds and then opened the door wide and said, come in, both of you. I'll put the kettle on." Helena Marsh was, indeed, a woman who had made her own choices. She had been engaged twice in her youth, and had called off both arrangements without apparent remorse. She had supported herself for 30 years through her skill with a needle and her reputation for discretion. She had strong opinions about water rights, which she expressed to anyone who would listen, and she kept a library of books that took up an entire wall of her parlor and overflowed into the kitchen. She and Lydia recognized each other immediately in the way that people recognize themselves in others, and the relief on both sides was visible and physical. That first evening, Helena fed them well chilies and beans and fresh tortillas from the kitchen of her neighbor Senora Vargas, who provided meals in exchange for Helena's mending. And while Patrick tended the horses in the small corral behind the house, Helena and Lydia sat at the kitchen table, and Lydia told her aunt everything. Helena listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Lydia was done she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Your mother wrote to me about Gerald Whitmore. She was not enthusiastic." She paused. She was also not the kind of woman who stood between her daughter and a mistake. She believed in people learning their own lessons. "I think she might have hoped I would learn it faster," Lydia said. "You learned it at exactly the right time," Helena said firmly. "Not a day too late." She looked toward the back of the house where Patrick was. "He seems like a good man." "He is," Lydia said simply. Helena nodded. "Then that is settled." It was not, of course, that simple. Nothing worth having is ever quite that simple. But it was the foundation on which things could be built. And in the weeks that followed, they began to build. Patrick found work quickly in Tucson. There was always work for a man who was good with horses in a city that ran on them, starting at one of the large livery operations near the plaza, and quickly becoming indispensable through the combination of his skill with animals and his reliable, uncomplaining competence. Lydia began, with her aunt's help and connections, to inquire about teaching positions in the territory. Helena knew the woman who ran the subscription school on the east side of the city, a brisk and intelligent person named Mrs. Helen Fawcett, and she arranged an introduction. The meeting between Lydia Langley and Helen Fawcett was one of those encounters between 2 capable women who recognize each other's quality immediately and dispense with all unnecessary preamble. Helen Fawcett asked Lydia what she knew. Lydia told her, arithmetic through algebra, reading and composition, basic history, geography, the rudiments of natural science. Helen Fawcett asked her to solve 3 arithmetic problems on a slate board, which Lydia did without difficulty. Helen Fawcett gave her a paragraph to correct for errors, which she did thoroughly and accurately. Helen Fawcett said, "Can you start Monday?" And Lydia said, "Yes." She began teaching on the 2nd Monday of November and found, with an immediacy and conviction that left no room for doubt, that she had been meant to do this exact thing for her entire life. She was good with the children, patient with the ones who struggled, challenging to the ones who found it easy, firm when firmness was needed, which was not often because she had a quality of straightforward authority that most children responded to without requiring enforcement. She loved the work with a clean, uncomplicated love that was its own kind of joy. Patrick came to watch her class one afternoon, standing at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and when the children had gone and she was erasing the slate board, he said, "You should have been doing this a long time ago." "I know," she said, "but I'm doing it now." He smiled. "That's the right way to think about it." They were living separately, with propriety, Lydia at her aunt's house and Patrick at a boarding house 2 streets over, run by a widow named Mrs. Peralta, who charged fair rent and served a substantial breakfast. But they spent every evening they could together, at Helena's kitchen table, or walking the streets of Tucson in the warm, early evenings before the November cold came in, or sitting in the small garden behind Helena's house, where Lydia had begun to tame the overgrowth and plant winter vegetables in the sandy Sonoran soil. Patrick had begun to say things about the future. Not in large, demanding statements. That was not his way, but in small, careful increments, like a man testing the ground before he steps. He mentioned one evening that he had been talking to a man at the livery about the possibility of setting up a horse breaking and training operation. He mentioned another evening that he had seen a parcel of land for sale on the south side of the city, not large but workable. He mentioned that he had been writing letters to his sister in Kansas. Lydia listened to each of these things and understood them for what they were. She was not in a hurry, she had just come from the wreckage of being rushed, but she was also not afraid. This was different in every way that mattered. One Sunday in late November, they were walking along the Santa Cruz River at the edge of the city, where the cottonwoods had mostly lost their leaves, but the bare silver branches against the blue sky had their own austere beauty, and Patrick stopped walking and turned to her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want it to be very clear before I ask it that there is no obligation, no arrangement, no expectation. I want it to come only from what you want." She looked at him with great steadiness. "Ask me. Will you marry me?" he said, "not because it is expected, not because it makes things tidy, but because I want to spend the rest of my life in your company, and I think you want the same, and I think we could build something together that would be good and real and honest." He paused. "And because I love you completely and I believe you love me, and that seems to me a sufficient reason for 2 people to make a life together." She looked at him for a long, full moment. The river moved beside them, cold and clear. A pair of ducks swam past with an air of serene indifference to human affairs. "Yes," she said, "but not in a church." He blinked. And then he laughed, a real, full laugh that she felt had not been given enough room in his life up until now. "Name the place," he said. "Here," she said, looking at the river and the cottonwoods and the enormous sky. "Right here, or somewhere like it, outside with the sky above it." "Yes," he said, "exactly that." They were married on the 15th of December, 1878, in the garden behind Helena Marsh's small adobe house, in the late afternoon when the sun was low and golden, and the air carried the dry sweetness of the desert in winter. The garden had been made beautiful through Lydia's weeks of work. The overgrowth cleared, the beds turned and planted, the small courtyard swept, the border of the space lined with the dried seed heads of desert plants that caught the light like small stars. There were 12 people present. Helena Marsh, who stood beside Lydia with the expression of a woman whose faith in the eventual rightness of things had been thoroughly confirmed. Felix and Rosa Delgado from Oso Blanco, who had made the journey south when Patrick wrote to invite them, because Rosa had told him they would not miss it for anything in the territory. Harvey and Edna Brooks from Cottonwood Wells, who had turned up with an apple cake, and the information that they had known it would come to this from the moment the 2 of them had sat down to supper at their table. Aurelio and Thomas Ramos, who had happened to be in Tucson on trade, and who had received the news of the wedding with warm congratulations. Patrick's employer at the livery, a man named Sam Ortega, and his wife. Helen Fawcett, the school superintendent, who brought a gift of 3 new books for the school, and Mrs. Peralta from the boarding house, who wept throughout the ceremony with enthusiastic and unashamed emotion. The ceremony was performed by a justice of the peace named Robert Carey, who had been recommended by Helena as a man who could be trusted to conduct a service without editorializing. He was compact and precise, and he read the words in a voice that gave them their proper weight. Patrick wore a clean, dark suit that he had bought at the Tucson dry goods store. Lydia wore a dress of deep blue wool, the color of the sky just after sunset, that Helena and Rosa Delgado had made together over the previous 2 weeks, working from measurements, and the pattern of the blue cotton dress Rosa had given her in Oso Blanco. In her hair, she had pinned 3 dried brittle bush flowers that she had pressed between the pages of one of Patrick's books, saved from the original bouquet that had rested on the windowsill of the Redemption Creek Church on the day she had walked out of it. When Robert Carey asked Patrick to make his vow, Patrick looked at Lydia with the full weight of his attention and said, in a voice that was steady and quiet and absolutely certain, "I vow to tell you the truth and listen to yours. I vow to give you room to be exactly who you are. I vow to build a life with you, not for you, as your equal, as your partner, as the man who will follow you into any wilderness you care to walk into. I love you, Lydia. I will love you every day that I have." Lydia felt the tears before she decided to allow them, and she did not stop them, because she was done managing her own responses for the benefit of other people's comfort. She let them run and she took a breath and she said, looking at Patrick with everything she had, "I vow to be honest with you always, even when honesty is difficult. I vow to stand beside you as your equal, to work with you and disagree with you and learn from you. I vow to face whatever comes with you at my side and never pretend that things are fine when they are not. I love you, Patrick. I choose you freely and completely and with the full knowledge of who you are, and I will make that choice again every morning of my life." Robert Carey said the final words. Patrick put a simple gold ring, bought at the jeweler's on the main street of Tucson, on her finger, and she put one on his. And then he kissed her while Helena wept openly, and Edna Brooks applauded with her apple-scented hands, and Rosa Delgado looked at Felix Delgado with an expression that said, "I told you so." And the December light went gold and amber over the little walled garden, and the sky above them was the most astonishing shade of blue. The wedding supper was loud and warm and full of good food and stories told across each other, and Patrick and Lydia moved through it as a unit, that ease, that gravity toward each other, and it was, Lydia thought, exactly what a celebration should be, the gathering of good people around something real. Edna Brooks caught Lydia's hand near the end of the evening and said quietly, "You look like a woman who has figured something out." "You told me that when I left Cottonwood Wells," Lydia said, smiling. "I did," Edna said. "It was already true then, but it's more true now." They had arranged to stay in Tucson through the winter and the spring. Patrick worked at the livery, building his reputation and saving money steadily toward the horse-training operation he had in mind. Lydia taught school 5 days a week and found that her class was growing children from the east side of the city, whose parents had heard that the new teacher at Helen Fawcett's school was thorough and fair and genuinely good at her work. She was using not only the books Helen Fawcett supplied, but supplementing with materials she made herself, exercises she wrote by hand in the evenings at Helena's kitchen table, maps she drew from the geography books in Helena's collection, arithmetic problems she generated from the practical realities of life in the Southwest. Helena herself had become one of Lydia's favorite people in the world. She was sharp and funny and unexpectedly gentle, and she had taken Patrick into her estimation with the same directness with which she did everything, deciding early on that he was a man of substance and making him welcome accordingly. She and Patrick had a friendship of their own that expressed itself largely in the form of vigorous disagreement about the plots of novels, because Helena's library gave them ample material, and they were both opinionated readers, and Lydia enjoyed listening to them argue about whether Mr. Dickens' characters were real human beings or convenient moral illustrations, while she made tea, and the evening settled around them warm and ordinary and full. Her father wrote to her in January. The letter was longer than the one Patrick had brought out to the desert in the early days. He wrote about the mercantile, about the winter, about the small news of Redemption Creek, who had married, who had moved on, who had been born. He wrote about Gerald Whitmore, who had left town in November and gone to Albuquerque, where he had, as efficiently as he did everything, become engaged to a woman named Caroline Phelps. Her father did not express an opinion about this. He wrote about missing Lydia. He wrote about her mother's painting of the ocean that still hung in the parlor. He wrote at the end that he had met Patrick Hawkins 3 times in 3 years, and that his assessment, done in retrospect, was that a better man would be difficult to find. He wrote that he hoped she would bring her husband to Redemption Creek when the time came, not for any obligation, but because he would like to know his daughter again. Lydia wrote back. She wrote honestly and warmly, and she told him about the school and about the house she and Patrick were looking at on the south side of the city, and she told him about Helena, and she told him that they would come in the spring and that she was looking forward to it. She folded the letter and looked at Patrick across the table. He was reading Dickens, naturally, and the lamp made a good warm circle around him and Helena's library and the stack of plates from supper that nobody had gotten around to washing yet. "My father wants to meet you properly," she said. He looked up. "I'd like that," he said. "It will be all right," she said. "He's not a bad man, he was just conventional." "Most people are," Patrick said. "It doesn't make them bad," she smiled. "You are very forgiving." "I have things to be forgiven for too," he said. "It seems only fair to distribute the grace evenly." She got up from her chair and went to him and leaned down and kissed him, and he put his book on the table and his hand in her hair, and Helena came into the kitchen at exactly that moment, looked at them and walked straight back out again, which they could both hear her laughing about in the hallway. By February, they had moved into their own place, a small adobe house on the southern edge of Tucson, 2 rooms and a courtyard, with a linta behind it that could serve as a stable. It was not much, but it was theirs in the complete and unconditional sense of the word, which made it feel vast. Lydia hung the green shawl from Edna Brooks on a peg by the door. She unpacked the crate of Patrick's books and arranged them on shelves he built from timber he got at the lumber yard. She planted the courtyard with the things that would grow in the Sonoran spring: tomatoes, squash, herbs she had gotten from Senora Vargas. Patrick brought home a cat, a large, opinionated orange cat who had been living at the livery, because he said the house needed something else with strong opinions in it, by which he meant something besides her, delivered with such a straight face that it took her 3 seconds to understand it was a joke, and then she laughed for a long time while the cat walked across Patrick's feet and sat down with the air of a person who has made a decision about real estate. They named the cat Felix, after Felix Delgado, because they both thought Felix Delgado would appreciate the compliment. Spring arrived in Tucson with warmth and desert flowers, the ocotillo blazing red along the roadsides and the palo verde trees turning bright yellow-green. And Lydia walked to school every morning through streets that were still cool from the night, and came home in the afternoons through streets that were warm and full of the smell of blossoms. And she thought often, with a steadiness that was not smug but was certain, that she had never been so well situated in her own life. In March, Patrick formally established his horse training operation in partnership with Sam Ortega, whose livery provided the facility and whose business connections provided the clients, and Patrick provided the skill that turned fractious, difficult horses into reliable working animals, which was work he did with a patience and intuition that was genuinely exceptional. The operation paid from the first month, not lavishly, but steadily, and steadiness was what they were building toward. And then in April, Lydia told Patrick that she thought she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning in the courtyard over coffee, while Felix the cat sat on the courtyard wall and supervised the desert with detached authority. She told him plainly and directly, because that was how she told him everything, and she watched his face go through a sequence of expressions: stillness, recognition, something that looked like awe, and then, arriving and staying, a happiness that was quiet and deep and genuine. He set down his coffee cup and took both of her hands in his and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked first. Of all the things he could have said, that was what he asked first, and it told her everything. "Yes," she said. I'm well. I feel well. She squeezed his hands. Are you glad? Lydia, he said, and the way he said her name was enough. She leaned forward and put her head against his shoulder, and he held her in the warm April morning in their own courtyard with the ocotillo blooming over the wall, and the cat watched them with its orange face and eventually lay down in a patch of sun, with the composure of an animal that has witnessed human emotion before and found it acceptable. They went to Redemption Creek in May. They made the journey in better condition than the journey they had made in October, with a proper wagon borrowed from Sam Ortega, good supplies, and the deep comfort of knowing the road and each other. The desert was beautiful in May, alive with spring growth and the particular clarity of the high desert light after the last of the winter was gone. Lydia's father, Clement Langley, met them on the street in front of the Mercantile, which she thought was probably as much of a concession to emotion as he was capable of coming out to meet her rather than waiting inside. He was 61 and looked it, the winter having added lines around his eyes and mouth, but he was upright and steady, and when he saw Lydia his face did the thing she had seen it do only a handful of times in her life, which was to stop managing itself. "Lydia," he said. "Father," she said, and walked forward and embraced him, and he held her with the slightly unpracticed quality of a man who has rarely allowed himself to hold people but means it absolutely when he does. He shook Patrick's hand and looked at him with the thorough, unhurried assessment of a merchant who has spent 60 years evaluating character, and then he said, "You struck me, the 3 times I observed you working at Croft's livery, as a man of unusual steadiness." He paused. "I am glad my daughter has someone steady." Patrick took this in the spirit in which it was offered. "Thank you, sir," he said. "I'm glad to have the chance to be that." Clement Langley took them through the Mercantile and upstairs to the rooms where Lydia had grown up, and he showed her the parlor with her mother's painting of the ocean still on the wall, and she stood in front of it for a long time, and Patrick stood beside her and held her hand, and her father stood in the doorway and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who is bearing something with as much grace as he can manage. "She would have liked him," Clement said, meaning her mother, meaning Patrick. "I know," Lydia said. "I think so too." They stayed 3 days in Redemption Creek. Lydia walked the town with the eyes of someone returned from a distance, seeing it clearly for the first time, seeing the smallness of it, and also the genuineness, the way the people were real even if their expectations were rigid, the way the land around it was beautiful even if what had been built on it had not always honored that beauty. She visited Clara Ortiz, who had made the wedding dress, and gave her 2 yards of fine blue cloth she had brought from Tucson, and thanked her for the work she had put into a dress that had, in the end, been worn for fewer than 2 hours in the church, and then rolled up in a saddlebag for 2 weeks. Clara Ortiz, who was a perceptive woman, said, "It was not wasted. It got you where you needed to go." She also walked past the church. She stood in front of it for a moment, looking at the steps where she had set down the desert flowers. A new coat of whitewash had been applied at some point over the winter. The church looked the same as it always had, plain and white and solid and small in the surrounding land. She was not angry at it. It was just a building. The decision that had been made in it and then unmade on its steps was hers, and it had been the right decision, and it was done. She turned and walked back to her father's Mercantile and found Patrick inside, discussing the quality of saddle leather with her father with what appeared to be genuine mutual engagement, and she stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment before either of them noticed her. And she thought that this was life, these ordinary, specific moments, the ones that did not announce themselves as important, the ones that were simply the texture of days well lived. They left Redemption Creek on the 3rd day with a wagon loaded with her father's gifts, bolts of cloth, jars of preserved fruit, a rocking chair that had been her mother's, and a small photograph of her parents taken on their wedding day in 1852 that Clement Langley pressed into her hands the morning they left without explanation, only the look of a man offering the best thing he had. Lydia held the photograph for a moment and then put it carefully into her bag. "Come south before the winter," she told her father. "I might do that," he said, in the tone of a man who has started to believe that might is more than might. The baby was born in November of 1879 in the adobe house on the south side of Tucson, attended by a midwife named Senora Catalina Torres, whose reputation in the city was such that Helen Fawcett had sent for her specifically. Arriving herself at the house with Senora Torres and a no-nonsense expression that made Patrick feel, obscurely, that things were in good hands. It was a long labor, 20 hours, which Senora Torres described as entirely normal and Lydia described as entirely exhausting, and Patrick spent most of it doing what he was told, and then doing the waiting that men did in those times outside the door, while Helena sat with Lydia inside, and Felix the cat sat on the doorstep as though maintaining a vigil. When the door opened and Helena said, "Patrick, come in," he had his hat so twisted in his hands that it had come somewhat out of shape. He came through the door and Senora Torres was at the side of the room putting things in order, and Helena was standing near the window with tears on her face, and Lydia was in the bed, exhausted and flushed and completely, absolutely herself, and she was holding a small, tightly wrapped bundle, and she looked up at Patrick when he came in with an expression he had no words for and would not have tried to put words to. "He is perfect," she said. "Come and see." Patrick came to the side of the bed and looked at his son, at the small, serious, squinting face and the miniature hands, and the thing that happened inside him was not possible to describe, which was appropriate, because some things should remain outside description, preserved in their full weight and completeness. "He has your nose," Lydia said. "He has your stubbornness already," Patrick said, which made her laugh, soft and tired. They named the baby James Hawkins, after Patrick's father, whose name had been James and who had ridden the cattle trails and died too young and deserved to be remembered. Helena stayed for 2 weeks after the birth, managing the house and the kitchen with cheerful competence while Lydia recovered, and Patrick alternated between work and the new and consuming preoccupation of learning what kind of father he intended to be, which turned out to be a thorough and attentive one, which surprised nobody who knew him. Clement Langley received the news of his grandson's arrival by letter and wrote back within the week. His letter was brief and emotional in a way that showed through the brevity. The brevity itself was the emotion, the fact that he could not manage more words without giving himself away entirely. He said he would come in the spring. He said James was a good name. He said in the last line of the letter the same position as that earlier line that Lydia had read 3 times in the desert, that he was proud of her. She read that last line to Patrick and watched his face carefully. He nodded. He said, "That's a good letter." "Yes," she said, "it is." Clement Langley came south in April as promised. He arrived on the stage from Santa Fe looking slightly diminished by the journey but entirely himself, and he held James Hawkins in his arms in the courtyard of the adobe house with the May sun warm on everything and the cat watching from the wall, and his face did the thing it did and could not be managed, and he said nothing at all for a long time, which said everything. He stayed for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, something was repaired between him and Lydia that had been worn and frayed for years, not by any dramatic reckoning, not by any confrontation or accounting, but simply by the passage of time and the presence of the baby and the ordinary days of a family sharing meals and conversation. Patrick and Clement Langley played cards in the evenings. They argued about the coming railroad and about cattle prices and about the politics of the territory with the vigorous comfort of men who have decided they can disagree without it being a problem. Lydia watched her father become someone she could be fond of, which was something she had not fully been able to do since her mother's death. When he left, Clement Langley shook Patrick's hand, and this time he held it longer and said, "You have done right by her." "She has done right by all of us," Patrick said, meaning it the way he meant everything plainly and completely. The years that followed were full in the way good years are full, not overflowing, not dramatic, but dense with living. Patrick's horse-training operation grew into something of real substance. his reputation spreading through the territory so that ranchers came to him from as far away as Bisbee and Yuma with difficult horses, and left with reliable ones, paying fair prices and returning with more, and recommending him to their neighbors, which is the purest form of professional praise. He and Sam Ortega formalized their partnership in 1880, and by 1882 they had a proper facility on the west side of Tucson with 3 hired hands, a large corral, and a training arena where Patrick worked in the early mornings with a quality of focused patience that made the work look easy, which was proof that it was the opposite. Lydia continued to teach. Helen Fawcett, recognizing in her an administrative intelligence that matched her classroom skill, offered her a position as co-superintendent of the school district in 1881, which was an unusual appointment for a woman of the time, and Lydia accepted it with the same plainness with which she accepted anything that made sense. She redesigned the curriculum of 3 schools, hired 4 teachers, and started an evening reading class for adults, men and women both, who had not had the opportunity to learn as children. The evening class filled quickly and was never less than full. Helena Marsh's health began to decline in 1882, not sharply, not suddenly, but with the gradual quality of a lamp whose oil is running low, warmth and light still present but diminishing. Lydia went to her every day after school, sometimes bringing James, who was by then a round-faced, serious 3-year-old with his father's eyes, and his mother's absolute certainty about everything. Helena adored him in the undemonstrative, practical way that was her style, teaching him to play cards, reading to him from her library in a voice that gave the stories full weight, arguing with him about the plots in a way that made him wrinkle his forehead with genuine engagement at age 3, which delighted Patrick. Helena Marsh died in the winter of 1883, peacefully, in her own house with Lydia beside her. She had lived entirely on her own terms for 54 years, and she left the world with the same composure she had always carried, and she left Lydia her house, her library, and a letter that said, "I knew when you arrived at my door in your road-dusty riding clothes that you were going to be fine. The only question was how fine. Finer than I imagined, as it turns out. I am not surprised." Lydia kept the letter with the one from her father that Patrick had brought out to the desert on the second morning, and with the photograph of her parents on their wedding day, in a small cedar box on the shelf above the books in the adobe house where James was growing up. They had a second child in 1884, a daughter, born in the spring, with Senora Torres attending again, as she had been attending every significant birth in the south part of the city for 20 years. They named her Margaret, after Patrick's mother, whose name had been Margaret and who had died of fever when he was 12, and who deserved to be remembered too. Margaret was different from James in every way: loud where James was quiet, demonstrative where he was reserved, climbing everything that could be climbed from the earliest possible age, and requiring a quality of supervision that Lydia described, accurately, as athletic. She had Patrick's coloring and Lydia's absolute determination, and she filled whatever room she was in with a quality of presence that made people smile without knowing exactly why. Clement Langley came south every spring. He sold the mercantile in Redemption Creek in 1883 to a young man from Missouri and followed his daughter south to Tucson, buying a small house 3 streets from Lydia and Patrick's, where he spent his last years in the mild southern winters within walking distance of James and Margaret, and the quiet satisfaction of having arrived, late but not too late, at the understanding that the best thing he had done in his life was to have a daughter who was exactly herself. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, December 15, 1884, Lydia and Patrick sat in the courtyard of the adobe house after the children were asleep. The desert winter night was cold and clear, the stars enormous above them, the same stars they had slept under in the high desert of the New Mexico territory 6 years ago, when they had been 2 people who knew almost nothing about each other except that they were heading in the same direction. Felix the cat, venerable and opinionated, was asleep on the courtyard wall. Patrick had made a fire in the small outdoor fire pit, and they sat beside it, close, in the way of people who have been close for years and have grown into it so naturally that the closeness is structural, is part of the architecture of their days. "What are you thinking?" Lydia asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm thinking about that first night," he said. "The camp by the sandstone, you in the wedding dress with the thorns in the hem." She smiled. "I still have that dress." "I know," he said. "I found it at the bottom of the trunk last week. I keep it for Clara Ortiz," she said. 6 weeks of her work." "I know why you keep it," he said, with the ease of a man who knows someone very well. She leaned her head against his shoulder. The fire was warm. The city was quiet around them, not silent, but settled into its evening sounds, the distant bark of a dog, the thin music from somewhere down the street, the ordinary music of a place where people were alive and living. "Do you know what I think about?" she said. "Tell me." "I think about Rosa Delgado saying that you watched me the way a man watches something he is afraid to look at too long," she said. "I think about that because it was the first time it occurred to me that I was worth watching." He lifted his head and looked at her. "You were always worth watching," he said. "That was never in question." She raised her eyes to his, and in the firelight she saw exactly what she always saw, the river stone gray, the steadiness, the quality of presence that had been walking beside her in one form or another for 6 years now and showed no signs of ever not being there. She raised her hand to his face. He turned his mouth into her palm. "Happy anniversary," she said. "Happy anniversary, Lydia," he said. Above them the stars continued their ancient work, indifferent and immense, and the fire burned down to coals, and the cat slept on the wall, and in the rooms behind them James and Margaret slept the deep sleep of children who are safe and loved, and do not yet know how rare that is, though they would know it later, because their mother and their father were the kind of people who made sure the things that mattered were said aloud. In the morning there would be school and work, and the particular negotiations of ordinary life in a house with 2 children and a cat, and 2 people who had decided that honesty was the foundation, and had been finding, 6 years running, that foundations hold when they are true. In the morning James would come padding into the kitchen for breakfast with his father's face and his mother's certainty, and Margaret would be up before either of them, already climbing something, already absolutely sure of herself in the world. In the morning Clement Langley would come for his Sunday visit and sit in the courtyard with his coffee, and watch his grandchildren with the expression of a man rediscovering, in his 67th year, what matters. But that was the morning. Tonight there was only the fire and the stars and the 2 of them together, in the life they had walked into the wilderness to find. Lydia Langley, Lydia Hawkins. She was now, though she kept both names the way you keep both your hands, had left a church one Saturday in October of 1878, and set down a bouquet of desert flowers on the steps, and walked out into the open land without a destination or a coat or a canteen of water. She had been 23 years old, and she had been walking away from something, and she had not yet known she was walking towards something, which was perhaps as it should be. The walking itself had been the point. The wilderness had been the point. And the man who had followed her, not to bring her back, but simply to make sure she did not walk alone, had turned out to be the most important choice she had ever not made, because it had been made for her by the wilderness itself, by the fact of him looking up from a broken cinch strap and seeing a woman in white walking into the open land and knowing, without knowing why he knew it, that someone should follow. She had built a life. A real and chosen life, made of honest work and good love, and the particular satisfaction of doing things that needed to be done with skill. She had built it in the way you build anything worth having, not in one gesture but in 10,000 small ones, the accumulated weight of ordinary days fully lived. The fire went to coals. The cat slept. The stars moved in their slow arc across the enormous sky. Patrick put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat there together in the good darkness, which was not empty but full. The way darkness is when you are warm inside it. The way everything is when you have arrived, after all the long miles, exactly where you are supposed to be.